After we discussed the difficult start into the Third Age with Isildur's death, followed by some peaceful centuries and the Istari appearing, we now look into a time of change, where the evil reappears in the northwest of Middle-earth. A big topic of this video will be Thranduil and the Silvan Elves, but also the war against Angmar and the Great Plague, all from Elrond's perspective, because this is still part of the Who is Elrond video, though this part works as a standalone video as well. My name is Chris, aka The Philosopher's Games, and before we start, a few hints. As always, I try to pronounce names as Tolkien described it, which means there will be drilled R's. Shoutouts to the artists who allowed me to use their fantastic artworks like Kimberly80, Sarah Morello, Ted Naismith, Jenny Dolphin, and all the others. Also, spoiler warning, but let's start. We know from the events before the story of The Lord of the Rings that Gandalf had not only contact with the elves from the Woodland realm, but also trusted them, so he might have slowly established this in his early days already, though this good relationship is maybe based on the events of The Hobbit. On the other side, Gandalf as an Istar was looking for signs of Sauron and trying to form resistance against him. Leaving out Thranduil and his Silvan Elves makes very little sense from that perspective. Also, these elves, the woodmen, the beasts of the forest and the fleeing hobbits were probably the first who had an idea that something evil was inside Greenwood the Great. As a result, they would be a great source for him and the wise. I always thought that Sauron entered the forest in secret and his presence brought evil, at least to the south of it, driving the elves into the north. But while doing research I learned that the process was far more stretched out, as mentioned. As early as in Second Age, these Silvan Elves started to find new grounds for them, maybe because Sauron's power increased and his creatures got close to Greenwood, maybe even entering it. I think this is smart by Tolkien because it gives the elves of Greenwood a motive to join the last alliance and establish Sauron as their enemy as well. And around Third Age 1050, Sauron secretly returned and hid in this forest. I should say an evil presence was noticed there at that time. I guess nobody knew it was him yet. The fact that Sauron chose this place as hideout hints at it being a place where information is concealed within. The Dark Lord found a spot for him, corrupted the forest and lured evil creatures into it, which potentially drove the elves further away. One could theorize that this operation was maybe going on for some time. Maybe the Ringwraiths prepared Sauron's hiding there in advance, which might explain some mentions of the movements of the elves. Then, at some point during this, Thranduil maybe established his halls. One could argue it's possible that this happened even before the War of the Last Alliance. I'm a bit sad that I could not find a more definitive answer to that. In the north of Greenwood, we find the Emyn Duer, the Dark Mountains. According to one version in the Unfinished Tales, the elves dwelt west of those in the Second Age already, and Orofer, that is Thranduil's father in one version, had to move north 3 times. Later, when Sauron returned, these mountains, quote, became a haunt of many of his most evil creatures and were called Emyn nu Fuin, the Mountains of Mirkwood. If we look at the map, we see how large this area is. In my opinion, there is no way this process of infestation of more than half of Greenwood the Great went unnoticed by the wise, which is reflected in the change of its name. In Appendix B of The Lord of the Rings, and also slightly altered in a version of that published in Peoples of Middle-earth, we find the following note. Circa Third Age 1100, the wise, the Istari and the chief Eldar discover that an evil power has made a stronghold at Dol Guldur. It is thought to be one of the Nazgul. Note that the mention of one of the Nazgul as explanation is missing in the version from Peoples of Middle-earth, but it's a very plausible assumption and it seems Tolkien saw it as a needed addition. This must have been the hot topic of this time. King Thranduil and his elves were pushed further and further north for centuries. Some evil presence, maybe a ring race, now appeared there and made things worse. As a result, Greenwood the Great is called Mirkwood. The Mirk in Mirkwood comes from murky, and the name Mirkwood has a very similar Old Norse form, Myrkvidr, meaning Mirkwood. There's of course a similar Old English form as well, and we know the Old Norse word from Norse mythology. For example, we find it in the Poetic Edda in the poem Lokasenna, stanza 42. Old Norse also fits the region east of Mirkwood. That's an interesting little detail because the men living east of Mirkwood, that is where we find Old Norse names in Tolkien's world, probably noticed the change too and had more contact with the woodland realm than the areas west of the Misty Mountains. Maybe the renaming of the forest is based there, or due to this change Tolkien moves the wood more into the realm of mythology. The name Gandalf is Old Norse as well and probably originates in this region. Elrond for sure discussed this with Gandalf and had an eye on this development. Maybe he sent messengers to Thranduil. In this context, the evil should not stay east of the Misty Mountains. There was strife among the three kingdoms of Arnor, and the Witch King, the chief of the Nazgul, sensed an opportunity. I could not find out if Sauron gave him this task or if it was his own idea, but considering that Sauron had power over him and that the presence of other evil creatures around several regions of Middle-earth was increasing at the same time, I think Sauron might have been involved in making the plan. Quote, Circa 3rd Age 1300, evil things begin to multiply again. Orcs increase in the Misty Mountains and attack the dwarves. The Nazgul reappear. The chief of these comes north to Angmar. The Periannath migrate westward. Many settle at Bree. So now the Witch King went to the northwest, gathered hillmen and orcs and founded his realm, which was called Angmar, meaning Iron Home, somewhere around 3rd Age 1300. He brought his influence over Rhudaur, which was close to Rivendell, and the line of Isildur and the Dúnedain failed there. The hillmen took over the rule and drove the remaining Dúnedain out. We find an interesting quote in Peoples of Middle-earth. In Rhudaur, an evil folk, workers of sorcery, subjects of Angmar, slay the remnants of the Dúnedain and build dark forts in the hills. I assume these forts or towers are those mentioned in the chapter Flight to the Fort in Lord of the Rings. Quote, here and there upon the heights and ridges they caught glimpses of ancient walls of stone and the ruins of towers. They had an ominous look. I could imagine at the beginning no one knew that they allied with Angmar, maybe even the foundation of that dark realm was quite secret. This was around 3rd Age 1349. It led of course to further conflict and war inside of Arnor, and of course the Witch King became known as the Witch King of Angmar during this war. I covered this conflict multiple times by now in videos, so I skip a bit through the War of Angmar. See episode 15 to 17 of my book Analysis and Film Differences series. I also covered it in the Who is Glorfindel and Who is Círdan video as well. Meanwhile in Gondor also trouble was on the horizon. The king of Gondor married a noblewoman of the Norsemen, which was a scandal in Gondor, and people feared it would weaken the royal bloodline and reduce the lifespan of their descendants. In parallel, we have another mention of the Hobbits settling in Bree. According to Peoples of Middle-earth, it means hill. Bree is at the crossroad of two very important trading streets. We talked earlier about the irony of the Hobbits leaving Greenwood due to Sauron's activities there. The Stur Hobbits in this conflicted time travel back over the Misty Mountains and settle around the Gladden Fields, again due to the activity of Sauron, or the Witch King to be precise. It was a lot of chaos at this time, and it was the perfect time for Sauron and his servants to make a move and distract the wise from looking into what happened in Mirkwood. One of the points of interest that fueled the inner conflict of Arnor was Amon Sul, Weathertop, with the chief Palantir. It was exactly where the borders of all three kingdoms of Arnor met. Angmar with Rhudaur under its control could intensify the inner minor conflict until it was too late, and then started to attack. This war went on for centuries. Isildur's line in Cardolan came to an end at some point, and they allied with Arthedain, or accepted their claim for kingship of Arnor. There, the bloodline of Isildur was in contrast still intact. Arthedain could hold Weathertop and fortified it. Lindon and Cardolan helped with this too, it seems. But Cardolan was still under a lot of pressure, and maybe allying with Arthedain was too late. Angmar with Hrodaur was too strong and Cardolan too weak. Still, this conflict went on for decades, and some kings were slain in the many battles. One might ask, what did the elves do? Lindon helped Arthedain and Cardolan as mentioned, and according to Appendix A, quote, it is said that at this time Rivendell was besieged. That is, to my knowledge, the second time that Rivendell is besieged. The first siege was in the Second Age when it was founded. Some call it the Second Siege of Imladris, but it's not an official term from the books. We have no other information about the Second Siege, but for sure Elrond was not a fan of it. However, he could hold Rivendell against the enemies from Angmar and Hrodaur, it seems. He probably sent messengers over the Misty Mountains, the High Pass is directly behind Rivendell, to LotR, and we can read that he later gets help from there. Interestingly, Amros could have been the ruler of LotR at this time, as he only died 500 years later, so he sent help and maybe even came to Rivendell to Elrond's aid himself. It could also be that Elrond initially went to Lorien himself to ask for help. The text states Elrond brought help. Passing the Misty Mountains was dangerous at this time though, because of the increased orc activity. Quote, orcs increase in the Misty Mountains and attack the dwarves, so the Misty Mountains became slowly more infested and there were battles involving the dwarves of Moria. We can also assume that the Witchking came to Eriador over the Misty Mountains, so it makes sense that we see more activity in these mountains. Third Age 1409, Angmar and Hrodaur under the Hillmen, which in my opinion became at some point part of Angmar, surrounded Weathertop and destroyed it. The Dúnedain had to retreat. Even the king of Arthedain was slain, but the Palantir of Amon-Sul could be saved and was brought to Fornost, capital of Arthedain at this time. Anúminas was maybe abandoned after Arnor split. At some point, the remaining forces of Cardolan hid in their barrows, the Barrow Downs, but were defeated. The Witch King later summoned evil spirits to infest those, the Barrow Wights, most likely around 3rd Age 1636. My assumption would be to prevent other Dúnedain from using them as hideouts after Cardolan's defeat. Maybe they were even sent earlier to drive the remaining Dúnedain of Cardolan out of those barrows, but the texts don't indicate this. The war went on and Arthedain now had to hold Fornost against the enemy, in which they were successful for some time. Lindon helped Arthedain, and Rivendell under Elrond, with help from Lorien, could subdue Angmar for some time. As mentioned, the war made the hobbits move, some back to the wilderlands around the Gladden Fields. Rovanion means wilderlands. Others went west and south. Meanwhile, in Gondor, the mentioned conflict escalated as well, and the rightful heir of the throne of Gondor had to flee, also to Rovanion, while a distant relative took over the rule. Osgiliath burns and its Palantir, the biggest of the Seeing Stones, is lost. This conflict in Gondor is known as the Kin-Strife. Gondor's rightful king Eldacar returned, gathered his mother's kinsmen, the Norsemen from Rovanion, plus some Gondorians on his way who were not happy with the new king, and together they managed to slay the usurper and take back the throne. The usurper's name was Castamir, and his sons and followers fled to Umbar, where his descendants got influence over the Corsairs and became leaders. Then, while and during Gondor recovered from the civil war, the Kin-Strife, they neglected watching over Mordor and had some other conflicts which had to do with Umbar and Harad in the south. We can say that with losing a Seeing Stone, their power of communication and seeing things in advance advance was diminished. In addition, Mordor was not guarded anymore. As a result, a return of Sauron to Mordor became far more likely. Elrond maybe knew about those conflicts in the south, but he was for sure too busy with the war against Angmar. I could imagine that in this time Gandalf maybe visited Gondor or the far south. Him visiting the south is implied in the Unfinished Tales. Quote, "Many are my names in many countries, Mithrandir among the elves, Tharkun to the dwarves, Olorin I was in my youth in the west, that is forgotten, in the south Incarnus, in the north Gandalf, to the east I go not." Gandalf is not mentioned in the texts about the Angmar War, so maybe he was simply not there. In contrast, Glorfindel is mentioned though, same with Elrond and Círdan, which seems unusual considering what an important character Gandalf is. As a result, my assumption of him looking over things in the south might not be too far off. These Gondorian conflicts were also the explanation why Gondor did not send help to Arnor. There is another reason we come to in a moment. In all this chaos, something interesting happens 3rd Age 1601. Hobbits from Bree migrate to the land beyond the Baranduin and are granted this land by King Argileb II. The only conditions, according to the prologue chapter of The Lord of the Rings, were that they maintain the roads and bridges in this land, for example the Brandywine Bridge, or also called Bridge of Stone Bows, speed the king's messengers, and acknowledge his lordship. And yes, this led to the foundation of the Shire. It seems so unusual that in this century-long war against Angmar, the Shire was founded, which will become the foundation of Sauron's and in parts the Witch King's downfall. 3rd Age 1630, they are joined by the Sturs from Dunland, those who fled south, not those who fled to the Gladden Fields. There is no mention that Rivendell knew about this, but in my opinion it is possible. We only know that King Argileb II knew about the Hobbits. This route might have been important for him in times of war, and he now had not to worry about maintenance. Considering that the elves worked together with Arthedain, I would be surprised if they did not know about these new allies. But 3rd Age 1636, something terrible happened in already terrible times. The so-called Great Plague spread from Gondor and at some point even reached Arnor. This was also the time when the Witch King summoned evil spirits, the mentioned Barrow-wights, to the Barrow Downs of Cardolan. Those downs were most likely built by some of the forefathers of the Edain on their journey to Beleriand, I assume by the House of Marach. The plague was probably the final nail in the coffin for Cardolan, and it was destroyed. The Barrow-wights made sure it remained this way. As said, I guess the barrows were used by the remaining people and forces as secret bases and hiding places, which now was not possible anymore. The Hobbits also suffered great losses due to the plague, but it did not spread much further, and North Arthedain was little affected, while it was really devastating for the rest of Eriador. The question is, where did this plague come from? In the Silmarillion we can read, "A plague came upon dark winds out of the east, and it smote the king and his children, and many of the people of Gondor perished." We also find this phrase in Appendix A. "Soon after, a deadly plague came with dark winds out of the east." Dark winds might hint at something supernatural and evil, so some assume it was made by Sauron. In the First Age, Morgoth also created a plague according to the Unfinished Tales, and referenced in the Silmarillion in one sentence about Túrin's first sister. Ever will some new evil be hatched in Angband, beyond the guess of elves and men, they said, and in the autumn of that year, to point their words, there came an ill wind from the north under leaden skies. The evil breath it was called, for it was pestilent. Interestingly, when Sauron's body is destroyed due to Númenor being swallowed by the sea, we can also read in the Silmarillion, "But his spirit arose and fled back on a dark wind to Middle-earth, seeking a home." This phrase we also find in Appendix A. but Sauron fled back to Middle-earth, a spirit of hatred born upon a dark wind. That is not a proof, though. Tolkien uses the phrase dark wind also in context with, for example, the Balrog, here more metaphorically, quote, "Then the echoes died as suddenly as a flame blown out by a dark wind, and the enemy advanced again." One could argue it is used in passages with supernatural elements, and considering that the first Dark Lord was able to utilize a plague as well, why should Sauron not be able to repeat the trick to some degree? I think it's at least a very plausible theory, and the timing of its appearance was just perfect. It's impressive that Sauron, while hiding in Mirkwood and still recovering, brings a plague into the world that changes so much while nobody even knew it was him. One other detail that must be considered is that Elrond is a healer. Vilya, the ring of power he possessed and could use after Sauron lost the One Ring, was a ring of understanding, making and healing to preserve all things unstained. Elrond for sure used it to form and protect his realm Imladris, like Galadriel in Lothlorien. Both places seem very different, but both also feel like they fell out of the world, which is very likely due to the rings of power they possessed. But I could imagine that Elrond also tried to help the people of the region with his skills, and one could argue that maybe the plague lost its deadliness and power while moving north due to Elrond with Vilya being there, preserving health and healing the people. Interestingly, Lalais, the cousin of Elrond's grandfather Tuor, she was the mentioned first sister of Túrin, also died to the mentioned pestilence that came from Angband, created by Morgoth, so there is some history here. Elrond healing people during the Great Plague is not mentioned in the texts though, and just a theory of mine, but it seems plausible, at least for Rivendell and surroundings. Still, the plague weakened the region, and the might of Angmar must have been great. The plague also hit Gondor hard, and was the mentioned other reason why Gondor could not send help to Arnor. We can also read that the White Tree withered, maybe symbolizing the state the Dúnedain realms in exile were in. Third Age 1640, the king of Gondor moves the king's house to Minas Anor, we know it as Minas Tirith later, and plants a new white tree while Osgiliath falls to ruin. Tolkien really stacks up a lot of events in parallel to make this very plausible, and I think he succeeded. Then, Third Age 1810, Umbar is retaken and the Corsair are driven out. I mentioned Castamir's descendants earlier. The last of them were slain by King Telomechtar here after they caused a lot of trouble, and even slaying Gondor's King Minardil, the father of Telomechtar. And Third Age 1851, Gondor is attacked by a big Easterling group known as the Wainriders, who use horses and wagons in battle. They will pressure Gondor a lot. There is even a coordinated attack of Wainriders and Haradrim who attack the south. We can also read Third Age 1940, Gondor and Arnor renew communication and form an alliance, but still they can't really send help yet. In this time, Arvedui, prince of Arthedain, weds Firiel, the daughter of the king of Gondor. At this point, Arvedui's father was still king. Arvedui means last king, and this name he got due to a prophecy of Malbes the seer. The seer foretold that he might be the last king of what remained of Arnor. Gondor can drive the attacks back under great losses. Even the king and his sons were slain in battle. So the throne goes to the line of the king's distant cousin Eärnil II, who is also from Anarion's line. However, Firiel was still there as last remaining child of the king, and she also had an argument, though in contrast to Númenor, ruling queens never existed for Gondor. However, in her case, she was married to Arvedui, who was from the direct bloodline of Elendil, father of Isildur and Anarion as well. So Arvedui tried to claim kingship of Gondor, but this was refused by the nobles. Instead, Eärnil II became king, who saved Gondor in that war against the Haradrim and then against the Wainriders, so he had a lot of good arguments for him. This was potentially the important decision in the mentioned prophecy of Malbes the seer. Though a choice will come to the Dúnedain, and if they take the one that seems less hopeful, then your son will change his name and become king of a great realm. If not, then much sorrow and many lives of men shall pass until the Dúnedain arise and are united again. They took the hopeful option, resulting in pain and sorrow for all the Dúnedain until Aragorn II, over 1000 years later, who will unite them again. I always ask myself if Malbes and Elrond knew each other. I assume Malbes lived in Arthedain, which was in this region as well. Also, Elrond had the gift of foresight, same as Círdan. Sadly, nothing is mentioned about the meeting, but I would see Malbes as one of the wise of his time too. His prophecies were spot on. He also makes a second prophecy which plays a big role for the Lord of the Rings regarding the paths of the dead. Sadly, Third Age 1974, Fornost was captured by the Witch King, and Arvedui, the king of Arthedain, which was all that was left of Arnor, had to flee. If your king of your once powerful realm is called Last King and you lost your capital city to the enemy, you know things are not looking great. How these tragic events will resolve and how the war against Angmar will end, we will discuss in the next part. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. I would have loved to cover the rest of the war against Angmar in this video already as well, but then it would have gotten too long. This one already took me longer to produce than expected, but at least it has some interesting details in it. I guess one could say only about 1100 years to go for who is Elrond, but for those exists a lot of information. If you liked this video, feel free to press the subscribe and like button, leave a comment, recommend me to other Tolkien fans, and maybe also check out my channel for more Tolkien lore videos. I link some playlists in the description. Not sure what will be next. I assume there will be some news coming up, which I will cover, but I guess I produce the next part of this year. There might be some gaming related content as well on the gaming channel. Some big announcements were made already in this replacement E3 time, and there is more to come. I also will stream on Twitch if possible. Not sure what video will be next for the German lore channel though. Again, thank you for your support and watching, and goodbye.